owners of the traditional owners of the land that we're all on, spread out across this vast continent of many countries. Rose and I and Marg, who's sitting next to me, are on Gumbaynggirr land on the beautiful north coast of New South Wales. And we're going to invite people to introduce themselves. So maybe you could talk about where you are when we do that. But just want to pay our deep respects to traditional owners and custodians of the land of this continent, really since time immemorial, and just reflect on how much we have to learn about land custodianship from First Nations people internationally, really, and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So welcome. I'm Kerry Pearce, for those people who don't know me, involved in the Australian Community Land Trust Network and based in Bellingen on Gumbaynggirr country, and very involved in working on the establishment of the Waterfall Way Community Land Trust. And there's a handful of us, so we were hoping we'd have time to go around the circle and people could just introduce themselves and a little bit about our interest in community land trusts. And then we're very much interested, Louise, in hearing from you about this very interesting research that's been released about people's interest and appetite in the community land trust model as an alternative form of home ownership. So that's me. And also just want to mention that we are recording this community of practice so that it could be a useful resource in the future. So if you're not comfortable with that, you're very welcome just to stay with your camera off. But it is lovely to see faces. So I might pass to you, Bill, seeing we were just chatting, if you wouldn't mind just saying hello.
Oh, yes. Hi, Kerry. Nice to meet you. Hi, everyone. Yes, so I'm a little bit of an interloper here. We've got a loose group of people involved in the housing sector in Hobart, looking at starting a community land trust. And many of you might know Linda Seaborn, who is involved in setting up a housing cooperative in Hobart. So we're bringing a few people together in sort of very early discussions and really just sort of learning more. And that's why I'm here today.
You're very welcome. Great to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Michael, we might go to you next.
So I can pop off camera again quickly. Michael McGilligan, CEO of Viridian Developments. We're regenerative developers that are working around the country with communities to establish community land trusts.
Great, thank you. And involved in the Community Land Trust Network, Michael?
Sorry.
Just
yes.
to drop you in it. Yeah. And so there's someone on an iPhone, but we can't see your name. If you would like to introduce yourself, that would be great. And you might be on mute. Or you might not be there at all. Can the person on the iPhone hear us? I think we might be having some tech issues. So I might pass to you, Carl, while we figure that out.
Yeah, hi. Carl from Grounded down in Victoria, trying to help the CLT movement push along. Yeah, good to be here.
Great. Thanks, Carl. And I can see Eleanor has just joined us. But while she's joining, Marg, you might want to move over and just introduce yourself. Come.
Hello, I'm Margaret. I'm Kerry's partner, and we've been working together for many, many, many years on housing stuff. And it's a pleasure to be part of a movement that is so practically orientated to help working people who have been locked out get some housing options. So thank you, Louise, and thank you to everyone who's working on this.
Thanks, Mark. And that brings us to Rose, I think. Or have we locked this? So you're... Yeah.
Yeah, here I am. Hey everybody, my name is Rose and I'm Kerry's colleague from Bellingen. We helped to found the Housing Matters Action Group, which is a resident-led group looking at what we can do around our affordability crisis here locally. And a core part of that is the establishment of a CLT in the Bellingen Shire and surrounds.
Great, thanks, Rose. And Elena or Eleanor?
Yes, hello. I'm Elena. I'm part of Co-Housing Australia. So interested, in any kind of legal finance models that facilitate collaborative approaches to living.
Great, welcome, Elena, and great to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
We've lost the iPhone person, so they might try to get back in, but that brings us back to you, Louise. So I'm sure everyone knows Louise, so we won't do any formal introductions. Louise will introduce herself, but we are very much looking forward to the research that was released recently and doing a bit more of a deep dive into what people thought in the focus groups. And as I pass to Louise, just want to note and recognise the decades of effort that you've been putting into this work and how appreciative we are all that you are still doing it. And we're coming up with new emergent knowledge that's helping all of us. So thank you, and over to you, really.
Thanks, Kerry. So yeah, I'm Louise Crabtree-Hayes, based at Western Sydney Uni, and also the chair of the inaugural chair of the Australian Community Land Trust Network. So firstly, I want to recognise and acknowledge that I'm on the Barramattugal lands of the Darug Nation and pay respects to elders past and present, and also echo Kerry's acknowledgement of all the countries that everyone's coming in from, and pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folk here. And just on the sort of back catalogue of work, it's a massive shout out to everyone who's been involved in this over all of the years, many of whom are on the call. And one of the things about the research that's just come out is very much wanting to give the sector at large an evidence base to be using, to lobby, to advocate, to take to whatever stakeholders folk need to be talking to, whatever media, to be able to say, we've got an evidence base for interest beyond the usual suspects, because there's a perception or a possible interpretation of CLTs as a sort of bespoke model or a niche model. And I think the real strength of this research and what we've been able to demonstrate is that there is genuine mainstream interest in the sorts of options that we're talking about in the work that we're all doing. So shout out to everyone who's on this and all of the work that everyone's doing, to get CLTs up and running and doing all the amazing things that we know they're capable of. So I've got a slide deck which I'll pop up, and I will be talking through that. But while I'm going, if you want to ask any clarifying questions or whatever, just pop your real or virtual hand up, and if that doesn't work, then sing out. And obviously, we'll have time for discussion after it as well. So let me just, because I'm working on two screens and it always throws me when I do this, because I've got about a 50% hit rate on sharing the wrong screen for some reason. So let me just get everything set up and make sure that I actually share the right thing with you all. Okay. Okay, so are you now seeing my slides? Awesome. Yes. See, that right there feels like success. Okay, so let me just pull that back up so I can see where I'm going. Fantastic. So really, as you can see there, this was about testing the Australian market. So answering this question of, that's all very nice, but are people actually interested? And people who might not necessarily see themselves as part of an alternative housing movement or interested in alternative housing models. So really just going out and testing this in a mainstream setting. So, and as I said, it's very much about creating an evidence base for the emerging sector. So the paper is open access. So if you haven't had a chance to grab it, then do so. I might drop, I should probably drop the link in the chat at some point, or if someone else has got the link and can drop it in the chat so everyone can grab it, that would be very cool. So why did we do this? So CLTs are unfamiliar and uncommon, which can impede uptake and implementation. So we do hear, oh, that's great, but no one knows about them. What are they? Is there any interest? So in the absence of evidence, we hear unbased claims being made about a lack of interest or appetite among the mainstream market. So we're really answering that and going, well, what is the actual market and what is the interest in them? So some of those claims might include things like not only are people not interested, but they may be or feel trapped in a resale restricted home ownership product. So what we did here was focus on the ownership interpretation of or the ownership models that CLTs do alongside the rentals that have that perpetual resale restriction. And so we were partly seeking to address this issue of whether people would feel trapped or whether that's actually a thing or not. We also wanted to do a bit of myth busting and test the importance of clarity, because there had been previous work done around shared equity products that said this is actually something that people walk away from. They're not interested in them. But when we looked at that research, there was an intentional lack of clarity built into their methodology. So that research actually said that when they were explaining the models to their focus groups, they were intentionally vague. And their rationale for that was that they thought that would prompt questions and be able to trigger a discussion. Our concern was that if you go to a focus group with a model that you don't explain, that might actually turn people off and might make people less inclined to ask questions, because they might not even know what questions to ask. And also, as academics, we carry a lot of weight in terms of being perceived as experts. So if we can't explain it, jeepers, it must be seriously complicated. So we went into it very much with a point of view of free, prior and informed consent, making sure people know exactly what we're talking about. People understand it. They can ask questions. They can kick the tires and go, what is this? How's it work? What if this happens? What if that happens? Because then they can actually make a decision and think about it in the context of their own lives and decide whether it makes sense for them or not, or whether it's of interest or not. So as I said, we're looking to test and address those market concerns, but also considering that difference. What happens when the models are actually clearly explained to people? Do we see a difference in terms of people's responses to them? So the reason we focused on ownership was very much about addressing this idea of the missing middle. Now, given who's online, most of you probably know this stuff, but I think it helps in terms of the positioning of the argument and how we use the evidence. So we know we've got this almost entire absence of intermediate tenure forms like shared equity, equity co-ops or CLTs. We need them for that mobility and also to reduce the demand on private and social rental stock. So again, most of you probably know this. But if we talk about it in this way, it also does help do some of that mainstreaming or positioning them within a mainstream aspiration rather than seeing them as bespoke or marginalised spaces. Now, we can get into the politics of that and whether that's a good thing to do or not, because arguably, we could be making stronger pushes towards challenging the fundamental tenets of the property system. But I think for the purposes of actually just testing these claims about mainstream interest, positioning it as an intermediate product and saying this is addressing a fundamental gap in the market helps people to comprehend, A, our market is really simplistic and dysfunctional, and B, there are things that we can do to fix that and that do actually help make a difference to people and communities. So as we know, the housing landscape has these bits. We've got the private ownership and rental space. We've got all the affordable rentals, whether that's community or public housing, or the sort of sub-market affordables. We've then got this whole spectrum in the middle where this sort of, we've got this gap here between the affordability of the, where the private market is and the affordable stuff is. We've got this growing gap. And so that's where, we'd want to see the intermediate products sitting. We've got a few things. We've got some shared equity programs like Key Start. New South Wales government's looking at one. Feds are talking about one. International evidence suggests that those are inflationary, and also that because they don't have resale restrictions, essentially, and also that trying to leave by buying out the partner can become incredibly legally contentious, because you're sort of trying to calculate equity, particularly if you're staircasing, you're trying to calculate an equity proportion of a moving target, essentially, if the value's going up. So, so part of the reason as well for doing the research was to actually make that point about, well, yes, we do need the intermediate products, but we need them to be resale restricted, or we're just going to keep contributing to the problem if they're still inflationary models. So obviously the CLTs are here, and as we know, they can do everything as well as ownership. They can do co-ops and rentals and the whole spectrum. But again, it's just helping to think through that narrative. And this was also sort of how we positioned them in the focus groups as well, so people could get a sense of, oh, okay, so that's what this is about, and this is why we're talking about it. So we discussed the two options that are in the manual with the focus group. So the renewable lease, it's inheritable, restarts at resale. At the time, these were subject to the residential tenancies legislation glitch that meant you couldn't terminate within the first 5 years for anything other than a breach. So we explained that to people. So basically you couldn't sell within the first 5 years because of that. But that's changed since then. We stipulated that they couldn't sublet, sorry, that should say CLT, not CHP, or couldn't do it without approval from the Community Land Trust. So this isn't a market rate model. You don't get to Airbnb it. You don't get to put it out for long-term rental at an inflated price. We specified that all of the responsibilities around repairs and maintenance rates, etc., would all be specified in the lease, a very clear relationship about who's responsible for what. And we also explained that it did have an upfront premium that they would take out a mortgage for, and that that's set at an affordable level and has a resale formula that kicks in when they terminate. So we talked them through that. We answered any questions that they had about it. And we also explained that these were capable to be used on Aboriginal lands as well. We then talked through the deed and basically said, look, this is the same, essentially the same model, but this is a co-ownership model. These slides should have been edited, sorry. Same clauses around the repairs and maintenance, selling the property and insurance, etc. Resale or reversion formula as per the lease as well. So the focus group stats, we intentionally targeted people who were looking to buy housing in Melbourne, but who were unable to do so. And in the recruitment, we very much focused on ownership aspirations rather than talking about the community-led aspect, because, as I said, we're very much wanting to go to that sort of mainstream market to just see, is this of interest? So targeting people ages 25 to 36, we got 25 women and 13 men across 4 focus groups. 25 of them were in full-time work, 6 were part-time, 3 were on home duties, 2 were self-employed or business owners, and 2 students. So this is very much targeting people in work largely, but with an income but unable to buy. So the individual incomes range from 30 to 100,000. The household incomes range from under 50 to over 150. So very much in the moderate to high income bands at the time, both at the household and the individual level. So your classic key workers unable to buy housing near their work was very much who turned up. And so it was good to be able to speak directly to that issue, because we hear a lot of policy focusing on those people. And we also hear that that's the demographic that is driving up the rents in the private sector and also causing the bottlenecks on the community and social housing sector because they can't move into something. So it was really good to be able to capture that market exactly. So mainly small households, but a really interesting diversity of household formation. So you can see there, most were two-person households living with flatmates or their partner, but also things like living with a sibling, living with their parents and a sibling, living with their parents and their child. So a lot of multi-generational, cross-generational. And for those of us who are in the rental market, these are the people we know. These are the households that we know. We know what these living arrangements are like. So it was, again, really good to be able to just capture who's out there and their experiences. So the majority were renting in the private sector. Some were very, very small percentage in public rental, some living with their parents and some boarding. All of them said they'd like to buy at the moment, but can't afford to do so. And most of them were saving towards that, but just chasing the deposit gap. And in this sense of like, how much friggin' money do I need to save up to get this deposit? The thing just keeps getting out of my reach, and starting to have to look further and further and further away from work, friends, family, community, all the things that are in their lives. So we started out by asking people, how's it going renting? Because we knew people were going to want to get that off their chest. People were not enjoying renting, all the things we know. I can't have pets. There's no security. The rent keeps getting pushed up. I can't do anything to my house, my flat. It's in bad condition. I can't do anything about it. And I'm worried about asking in case I get the rent put up or I get kicked out. So all the things we know. And interestingly, people flagging that it was unsuitable for home-based employment. So people saying, I want to do community-based childcare. I've got my license, but I can't get this house compliant. Or if I get this one compliant and then I move, I've got to do it again. And so really impacting on people's economic possibilities and their livelihoods because of the housing stock. So I've loaded this up with quotes because the data is so much fun. So this woman was saying, last inspection when I had the 2 cats, just before I had the one, and he would go next door to a neighbour. So I'd get the neighbour enrolled in hiding the cat, but since I got 2, I was actually at home the day the landlord, the real estate was coming. So I put them in the car and we drove to the park. I sat there at the park in my car with my 2 cats like I'm a weirdo. And someone else in the group said, oh, the cat lady's back. And she said, yeah, it's pretty drastic. I shouldn't have to do that. That's my home. So it was this sense of like, what even? And I can't even be at home with my cats. And I've got to go sit in the park. So just really hearing these stories of the crazy things that it was doing to people. We then asked them about owning and what they thought at the moment in terms of their current options. A lot of them were concerned about where they'd have to move to. It's like, well, yeah, I could buy, but I'm going to be 50 kilometres away from everything that is currently in my life. And so really not workable for them. A lot of people saying they could afford the repayments, but not the deposit. And also, like I said, chasing that deposit gap. The main thing people wanted was stability, just not having to move anymore and not being subject to the rent increases. So it wasn't, I want to speculate on my house. It was, can this just stop? Can I just have some stability and some agency in my housing situation? So very much about having control, making improvements, being able to have pets, and adapting the home for work for people who are working from home. So all of those simple things but profoundly powerful things about homemaking, rather than I need to get on the property ladder. And that we didn't script these questions. We were just like, why do you want to get into home ownership? And this was what people were saying. So what we discussed was an inner city apartment at 25 to 50% deduction of market rate. So essentially the build cost. We said there's absolutely no staircasing. You can't buy the CLT out. We made that absolutely clear. We said if you want to get out, you sell back to the CLT at a resale restricted price to a pre-qualified buyer, or they oversee sale to a pre-qualified buyer. So there's absolutely no staircasing. None of them were worried about the resale restrictions. It was just not a concern. Also, the 5-year no termination clause wasn't a deal breaker either. We mentioned that and talked them through it, and people started spontaneously coming up with their own workarounds. Like, oh, if I suddenly had to move interstate because of family stuff, I'm sure I could work with the organisation to find someone qualified to rent it at an affordable rent while I'm gone, kind of thing. So they started doing the thinking once they actually understood the parameters of the model. So the equity and asset concerns only came up once everything else had been exhausted. They went through all the stuff around, where would it be? What would it be like? What's the stability? What's the resale? Blah, 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 blah. I can leave it to my kids. Excellent. And then it was at the leave it to the kids thing. They were like, oh, the kids might get less of a nest egg. But then they were like, but that's okay. If I've had stable housing for 20, 30, 40 years, I'll have been able to enable my kids in other ways. Maybe I'll have saved up money, or I'll have invested, or I'll have done X, Y, Z, and that's the equity that the kids can get, on top of knowing that the kids could inherit the resale restricted equity in partnership with the CLT. So again, once people understood it, they started interpreting it in the context of their own lives and their own aspirations, and not defaulting to those presumptions about this has got to be my nest egg, this has got to be the thing that enables my kids. It opened up all of the other aspects of people's lives and what they thought they'd be doing while they were living in the CLT. Nearly all of them would have signed up there and then if possible. I honestly thought they were going to mug us when we said, this is just research at this point, because they're like, where do we sign? Seriously. So yeah, I think it was quite an extraordinary process. Interestingly, they'd started talking about the other things they'd like as part of the package. So help with saving for the deposit. So they started thinking about it as a partnership. Like, can this organisation support me in my housing aspirations? Can they help me? Can they help me do financial planning? And some wanted that on an ongoing basis as well. So not just help getting in, but then also when they're in, how do I manage my finances? How do I plan for the future? So, and when we look internationally, a lot of the CLTs do that. It is a package. It's not just here's your home, good luck. It's let's talk about, how you organise this and what your aspirations are, and let's have a look at your budgeting. Let's have a look at what's going on. Very much a desire for clear language and transparent processes. So wanting to know, what's this organisation? What's it about? Very keen on the upfront independent legal advice. So all of that, the sort of partnership and the care and the clarity and the responsibility and the accountability of the organisation was very much of interest. There were varying levels of interest in being involved in the CLT. Some were like, yeah, absolutely, I want to get involved in it. Others were like, so long as they're there and I know they're doing their thing, it's all good. So speaks to that, what we see in the big international CLTs with the, sort of thousands of voting members, those differential levels of involvement between, well, I pay my fees, I turn up to the AGM, through to, I want to be on the board, I want to be on a subcommittee, what have you. Interestingly, totally unprompted, at least one person in each group was really genuinely excited about the perpetuity and the ongoing community benefit. So that's over 10% of a mainstream market starting to say, I love the fact that this is beyond me, and I love the fact that it's about future generations. So the idea that there isn't A, market interest in simply the ownership component, or B, in the greater mission of the organisations, like, it's showing there is actually genuine interest in both of those things. And these were, as I said, focus groups that were just advertised as being about, do you want to get into home ownership? So really interested to see the latent interest out there. So here's some of what people were saying. They're saying organisations like this have a huge potential to actually help people understand what's happening in the housing market, and actually to be able to give people broader skills to keep engaging with what they're doing and actually be engaging in what comes next. Everyone I know who's looking at buying a house is like, I'm flying blind. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. I don't know who to listen to or how it works, any of it. And then one of the fellas said, well, if they position themselves as someone much less scary than a bank for people to approach and talk about this stuff. So seeing someone who's neutral and who's actually going to give genuine, honest advice. and saying totally, but also less interested in direct profit. If you're not directly trying to sell me something and squeeze every drop out of me, potentially you've got more incentive to actually give me some useful information, not leave me fundamentally dependent on what you're telling me. So we hear this sort of questioning of the motives of current, financial lenders or financial advisors. So very much this desire to be able to speak to a mission-driven space and to mission-driven organizations. And this was in response to sort of thinking about participation and having a say. And one of the women saying, well, if I wind up in a not-for-profit, but all of a sudden in 10 years' time when their management decides that, oh, actually, they think lesbian families are a bit weird, it's like, I'll buy somewhere else. Thanks, guys. See ya. But if I'm spending that much of my money supporting a business, which I mean a non-profit, if I find at some point that group's values change, that's a big deal. If it's something that I'm invested in personally as well as financially, I like being able to have a say or at least know what's going on. So very much wanting to be part of that mission and to have that say and not be subjected to the whims of an organization. But then at the other, not at the other end of it, I think this is sort of speaking to the changes in people's lives, I guess, and the need for flexibility in how people participate. And so one person saying, maybe I like the fact that they're an invisible entity that I don't have to deal with. But then saying, like, if you need them, if they're there if there's an emergency. And she's saying, yeah, I know they're there, but not seeing them. But I guess later on, if I'm a stay-at-home mum and I want to do something so that I can give back to the community, like help out, do this, do that. So actually seeing herself and the ways in which her life might change and saying, well, at the moment I'm too busy. I love the fact that they're there, but who knows, over time, I may have the time and the capacity to give back to the community. So already seeing themselves as invested potentially over time in the organisation. And so the other woman was saying, I think it's also dependent on the values and the company itself and what they stand for, like their mission, I guess. That would really affect whether I'd give up my time for them. So again, these ideas around the values and the purpose, and that being a trigger in terms of whether people want to take part in it. And so this idea of organisational purpose came up repeatedly, and saying, I really like this quote that's saying, okay, so you want to get into the housing market, but I actually think I'd be most equally motivated to go into a setup like this just because I support this model more than I support the private ownership business model. The potential for it to do broader things, that would be a major selling point for me. It would be, yes, okay, you buy your house when you've got a little bit of that home ownership, good stuff, nest egg, whatever, but you're actually supporting something bigger with the potential to be influencing things outside of that. That would be a huge motivator for me. So again, just hearing this coming through. And so we then talked a bit more about, market rate rentals and ownerships and the experiences of that. And then someone saying, well, yeah, we can have these alternatives, but also recognizing that's not the only paradigm we have to work with. If you come into this and you go, cool, well, our aim is that everyone after 7 years is ready to go into the open market. Well, like, you're wasting your time because that's what everyone else is doing. If we can actually create a culture that says this is okay, imagine how many people don't have to work 3 jobs to pay rent and they can be home with their families or out in their communities and doing things and stuff. So again, seeing what this opens up once you've got that foundational basis of stability, and seeing it as, why do we have to accept these narratives that this is the only way we do things? And that was what was starting to come from people. And so the appeal of the model, so many reasons for appeal. So I've sort of got a few different takeaways from that. So one of the women saying, I think it's a really good opportunity for people. I think it's all fair, more than fair, really. It swayed my decision going forward with it. And another woman saying, I'm happy as long as it's a roof over my head and my daughter's head, basically. Living comfortably, food, clothes, whatever. At the end of the day, I'm just happy with a roof over her head that doesn't leak. So to an extent, the rental property market has set the bar pretty low in terms of what people need and want. But all of these are completely valid in terms of why people need stability, dignity, and choice, and why they need affordable quality housing. And so this fella saying, at the end of the day, whatever repayments and rates that I have to pay, if they're on par or less than what I'm currently paying on rent, then absolutely I would be interested. It was just down to, so long if I can afford it and it's good quality home, sign me up. And then this fella saying, can I just say the stability? The main aspect is stability, like knowing you've got a place that's yours. So for me, it's kind of two sides. I've got a place that I can call mine, but also it means I'll get some money aspects out of it. So again, that sort of entanglement of the appeal of the project. And then one of the women saying, one of the things I really love about this from an emotional side is the fact that it's in perpetuity. So to have a house that will appreciate, but isn't going to price out that next buyer or next generation thing, where a house is less of a money-making investment and it's more about that home and place. Like, I think that's a really unique part of what the program is really trying to do. And there's a fella saying, I just love the concept of helping renters get into the marketplace. If there's part of the package that says, we're going to help you get into this home, and if you're the person that puts your hand up for whatever you're talking about, we also have a plan for in such and such years or whatever, we're going to help you get out of this and into the next step. We're going to have an advisor to help you with the equity, even though it's a smaller portion, to guide you, support you, to lead that into the next step of the home outside of this. So even when it was being seen as a transitory vehicle, understanding and seeing it as a relational model where you're in partnership and it's about being supported in this journey rather than, yeah, just an abstract financial product or a standalone financial product. So then turning to, yeah, where I sort of see the role of the research in all of this. It very much helped that both me and the research assistant were long-term renters, and still are. You know, we could talk with people and have familiarity with the issues that participants experience in their rental situations. The fact that they didn't feel that they were speaking to people who are, you know, cashed up property owners with, you know, multiple portfolios and what have you. And we could just say, yeah, I hide my cats. I probably shouldn't say that if we're recording, but I do hide my cats, and my neighbour helps hide my cats. So, so we did a lot of bonding about hiding cats. The process itself, we had these really small iterative conversations. So there's like 8 or 9 people, or 9 or 10 people per group. So participants could explore the options more deeply. And we saw an extreme level of diversity of the questions that people asked and the points that they raised, which included the breadth of the reasons for their interest. So once we just created a space with that clear knowledge base established and a sort of cultural resonance because of the shared experience of renting, we were able to have these really fulsome and nuanced conversations about various aspects of the models. We could talk about things that had tried and failed overseas, lessons learned, what you do if this happens, what about that? And that prompted people to think further and deeper about it and to come back and ask questions as well. Oops, I went the wrong way. So like I said, our knowledge of the existing models and sectors, the successes and failures was vital. So it really highlights the option of making, the importance of making diverse options available and understandable. So that knowledge was absolutely crucial to it. We were absolutely grilled about the models. Once people understood, like once we'd laid out the basics, it was on, you know, it was like, you know, let's play 50 questions. And people asking a question, hearing the answer, a few more questions go, that person's sitting there thinking, they're listening to what other people are saying, and then they'll come back and take their question further. So they were great. They were really excellent, you know, really wide-ranging and probing conversations about it. So they were thinking through the options over the course of this discussion. We saw them looping back to prior points, considering the possibilities from their particular perspective. So really thinking about it in the context of their lives, what would work, what would be a snag, how they could see it, you know, opening up other possibilities for them. So I think there's a really key role here in terms of research playing a part in challenging the path dependency of housing systems. So, you know, I've written on this previously with Dominique Hess about the way that housing systems will just keep doing what they do. And it's not unique to housing systems. You know, Kerry, I'm sure you've seen this in the policy landscape, where once a system is set up, the easiest thing for it to do is to keep doing what it does. You know, getting things to change is quite tricky. And so part of this work, I think, is really important in terms of opening up these narratives, opening up spaces where people can actually start to talk about and lobby for alternatives on the basis of actually knowing what's out there and what exists and what a language is and what the key points can be. Yeah, people can't advocate for things or drive demand if they don't know what's possible. Yeah, and so there's a really key role there, I think, as researchers that we have a responsibility for in terms of making these things visible and tangible and understandable. So key takeaways, and this is my last slide, and then we can have a big chat about it all. There is a latent market. Yeah, that's probably the key takeaway. There's interest. People are interested in affordable ownership. They don't care about the resale restrictions. Once they understand the process of moving out, if they need to, once they understand the terms and conditions, you know, the interest was extremely high. You know, once people had been able to see themselves in it, think about it from their point of view, and know that there was going to be an organisation there that they could talk to about this stuff, people absolutely wanted to sign up. Attendees' reasons for seeking home ownership were diverse, and primarily it was, like we saw, that desire for stability, autonomy and dignity in their housing. It largely reflects their poor experiences of renting rather than an inherent feature of ownership. So we could just as equally do this through a long-term lease that doesn't have an equity component. Yeah, and that's what we see in the co-ops, in the rental co-ops, where it's like, you're a renter, but you've got agency, you've got autonomy, you know, all of these things, you've got the stability. So I think we do the market a disservice when we assume that people want home ownership simply for the purposes of making capital gains. We're erasing all of these other things, and we're also assuming that ownership's the only thing that can deliver them, whereas we know that we can use all sorts of other mechanisms like long-term leases with or without an equity component to deliver these key objectives. So I think challenging that narrative of, oh, Australians want home ownership and everyone understands it's a wealth creation vehicle. Yeah, I think we can open that up and say, actually, what people want is stability, dignity, and autonomy, and you can deliver that in a number of ways, which do and don't involve an equity component to it. And so, yeah, aspirations may or not be driven by expectations around investment and capital gains. For most folk, once they realised they had that stability, they thought about other ways to think about wealth creation, if that was even a priority for them. For a lot of people, it wasn't even something they mentioned during the discussion at all. It was all of those other core ontological components of home. The stability, the autonomy, the dignity were the key discussion points. So that's a bit of a deeper dive on it. Like I said, the paper is out there in the world. I opened the data set back up yesterday, and I'll probably write some more stuff about it, particularly around the way that people are thinking about home, because I think that really needs to be out there as the next piece of the argument. But having the first pass, just in terms of, yes, people are interested and no, resale restrictions are not a problem, I think is a really key thing for the sector to have. So I'll stop my share and we can have a bit of a chat.
That was really fascinating, Louise. I can see people clapping to say thank you. There's so much in that for us to talk about, I think, and we do want to have a bit of a chat. And while people are getting themselves sorted, I'd like to dive in with the first question, if that's all right.
Totally. Go for it.
Because I'm really fascinated that there was quite a strong group of people who were motivated by the community benefit, broader community wellbeing dimension of community land trusts, and seeing beyond, you know, their own individual needs for security and seeing that as something that they valued. And that had me wondering about, I'm just interested in how you recruited the focus group participants and whether you think that that is pretty reflective of the broader population. That, yeah.
Yeah, no, look, it's, yeah, we were really, I guess, surprised, but also really pleased to see that emerge. We went to market. We actually used an independent recruitment company, and they just went out through social media, online platforms. So it wasn't anything sort of affiliated with community land trust spaces or co-ops or any of the sort of diverse housing networks. It literally just went out through media, through the recruitment company. Literally just, are you looking to buy in Melbourne and currently unable to do so? So, I mean, obviously there's a bit of a filter there in terms of it being people who have the capacity and interest to turn up. We did 1 during the day and 3 in the evenings. We made sure they were right near a major transport station so that people could get there easily. We put on food. So we made it as accessible as possible, but obviously if someone's working 3 jobs, they're not going to necessarily be able to go to a focus group on a Wednesday night kind of thing. So that obviously there's that kind of selection filter running over it, but in terms of where it was advertised, it was just simply out there in public media through the recruitment company. And I think the thing about people's interest in the community angle really seemed to come the further into the conversation. And it was, I mean, I want to go back and do a reread of the data, but it seemed that once people had a sense of, okay, I'm in this situation, my housing needs have been taken care of, this thing's in perpetuity, there's a partner organisation that's a non-profit who's being very transparent. I think that then enabled people to think about all the other stuff they do, which was when they started thinking about the mission of the organisation, the stuff that they themselves might be able to do in their spare time, or not having as much pressure on their work life. So I think it was that process of putting themselves into the situation and thinking through it. The more we talked about the operational parameters of it and answered their questions around what things have happened overseas and the sorts of programs that CLTs have enabled. And it was really interesting. And I think because usually conversations around tenure or around home ownership models or what have you don't get beyond that first pass of just, exactly, it's the hierarchy of needs, because most of the time the conversation just stops at the housing and the tenure question. People don't then think about what would this then enable. And I think that's what we saw, was people stepping into that space.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting. Thoughts or questions or comments?
There are some questions in the chat. Someone asked, how close are we in Australia to having an operating CLT?
That's Grace. Hi, Grace. That's a question for others, I think. And hello, Grace.
How are you, Louise?
Oh, good. Lovely to see you. There you are.
Yes, thank you.
So Kerry, Michael, Carl, who wants Rose? Who wants to? There's so many people who can answer that question.
We're pretty close. Depends what you mean by operating, Grace. So, that's a little bit, you mean a CLT with a house with people living in it?
Yes. I think one with one house would be just magnificent and a great demonstration for all of us to see and observe.
Well, there is one with one house already in Moreton Bay on Raymond Island in Queensland. They're partway through constructing a house, the South Moreton Bay Island CLT.
Okay.
That's Gary. How do you say Gary's surname, Louise?
Flomenoft.
Yeah, from and Andrew Paul. We're probably a couple of years away, I reckon. I mean, we've got some very positive discussions happening with our council about land and some other land possibilities that we're pursuing, and some very positive work happening with a mutual bank who is looking at developing a mortgage product for CLTs. So, you know, access to land and access to finance are the two big barriers that we were facing. But our experience with the Waterfall Way CLT project, which we're lucky, very lucky to be funded to establish, is think about how long you think it's going to take and triple it, probably. But I think I'm hopeful that, you know, in a couple of years' time we'd have something very tangible to share. What about other people who are on the call in development stages?
I mean, I can briefly speak, I guess, on behalf of the Blue Mountains crew. I mean, I know Genevieve's not here, so I don't want to misrepresent them, but I know that they've had conversations with council, and CLTs are now actually getting written into the council's strategy, housing strategy, which is I think still in draft form. The network has a funding application in with the James Martin Institute of Public Policy to work on a policy platform for CLTs across the state. And that's building on the New South Wales Housing Minister's commitment to CLTs that she made at the launch of the network. I think their board's meeting at the end of the month. So we're just kind of watching the clock to see what the news on that is. So obviously that would be a terrific outcome to get funding to work on that platform, because that, I think, will really help in terms of having a supportive policy environment, and a policy environment that understands CLTs and is sort of mission ready and mission aligned. So we're just waiting with bated breath on that one.
Mm-hmm. What's happening in Castlemaine, Kyle, with the council and so on there?
Yeah, yes. Well, with Mackle, council has expressed some urgency, wanting to see things happening, particularly in the affordable farming side of the CLT world. So in Victoria, we only have permission for seasonal working villas on farmland, but it seems like there's a move for a pilot project in that sort of space. So we're getting together an application for that. And yeah, we're also working with a Airbnb entrepreneur who has put on the table 10 acres as a land gift in Hepburn Shire. And yeah, just finalising a letter to the Minister for Planning. So we're going to be meeting them in the next month, hopefully. So yeah, there's some good news from Victoria, but there's a group up in Brisbane. I can't remember the name, but it's something. The name is Friends.
Sharing with Friends.
Sharing with Friends. They
Yeah.
seem to be doing some good stuff in the CLT space as well.
They're really interesting because they're I've had, you may, others may too, but I've had quite a long meeting with them, and they came to develop the model without really thinking of themselves as a CLT, and are now understanding that the features of what they're doing very much are a CLT. So I think that, and their model's really interesting, and Zonta has helped support them in their establishment.
Talking about that, Rose, Zonta helping, and I think someone mentioned earlier that a mutual bank was assisting with the Moreton Bay one, I think it was. Partners are very, very important, and I'm wondering which organisations are most likely to partner with CLTs? Which ones would be the best to approach? Any thoughts?
It seems to be really place specific. Yeah, I mean, you do need financiers who understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it seems to be really place-based. Obviously it helps to have your local council understanding you, but then it's really just who are the key stakeholders in your part of the world and who's mission aligned. It's I think that and this is interesting actually. It came up at a round table on the apartment sector that I was at last week, where the language that emerged was around a mission aligned sort of ecosystem of landholders, policymakers, actual developers, builders, and which is what we've seen internationally, where you start to get this sort of coalition of the willing happening, where people are understanding a less or a decommodified housing form and are committed to that. And it's finding that network, it's finding those people who speak the same language and are driven by the same things and building those up. So I guess they're the ideal partners. It's not a particular sector, it's more of an ethos. But I mean, Kerry, I know you've been doing a lot of work on the ground with getting folk aligned around Waterfall Way. So I don't know whether you've got thoughts on that one.
Well,
and anyone else too.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it because it's sort of like there's layers of partnerships for us. And, our shires, I think it's something like 1,600 square kilometres, and there's 3 significant towns in the footprint of our CLT, and they're all very distinct and have their own community focus and, ecosystem. And we've got an advisory group of people, some of whom are institutional partners like council. Like I'd say working with local government in partnership is really critical. We would have, I don't think we would be able to do it without our partnership with council, even with the philanthropic backing that we've got. And other people who've got particular expertise from different sectors are on that group, sort of at an institutional level, including the person that I mentioned from the mutual bank. But then at the local level, we're working in the town in our shire that's on the plateau, which is called Dorrigo, which is a pretty conventional agricultural town of about 2,500 people, mainly farming community, and with some, big families that are, go back 3 generations or so. And then some newer people who've moved, who have, a more alternative ethos. And we're developing partnerships with people from right across the community, the Chamber of Commerce, Rotary, and then some of the newer, more alternative groups. And the thing that's binding people together is just an absolute shared understanding that they need a new way, that the housing crisis is so bad that even people who conventionally would have made a lot of money out of property and housing are discarding that capital gain motivation as the primary driver and really focusing on what they can contribute in the community to create some more stability for locals. So this is a long-winded rave, I guess, saying, that partnering with people institutionally, but then with people who are influencers for change in their local community, as well as First Nations groups, obviously. There are some particular key groups of people who have a heightened interest in land and are really key partners, but then it's about individuals who are agents for change in the networks that they're working in locally. That's a long-winded answer, I'm sorry. But I just think partnerships are so important in this space that it can't happen without, really.
Yeah.
It would be terrific if one of the big banks, or Bendigo Bank or Bank Australia or some of those others, could develop an interest in CLTs particularly.
Well,
that would give us.
We're really hoping that there might be an announcement in the next few weeks that sort of really speaks to that, because the bank that we're working with has brought a couple of other mutual banks together, and they're seriously exploring the development of a mortgage product for CLTs, because they see being a community-owned bank as giving them an additional sense of responsibility to giving back to the communities who created them, and have a narrative around the importance of contributing to affordable housing in those communities. So we've got our fingers crossed that the work they're doing at the moment, which is very serious risk assessment and design thinking work, will lead to, you know, something quite practical. And we're hoping to hear about that in a few weeks. So
Excellent.
if we do get positive news, we'll be sharing it ASAP, let me tell you.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Kerry. Yeah, the CHP sector is certainly one we've been working on and had some good results there. So that's been, you know, refreshing. But yeah, talking finance and the growing, you know, issues around fractionalized lending and how that's growing for the locked out generation. It feels like some of that goodwill, Louise, that came through in your report could easily come into that sort of crowdfunding space. And, you know, I know that one of the Californian NGOs has done work in this sort of space. But yeah, wondering if there's been any development on that sort of community bonds, fractional lending type approach. Where are we at there?
It's not something that we looked at with this work. I know there's been, I know there have been CLTs in the UK that have done crowdfunding for individual builds, or have used them as mechanisms to bring equity into the organisation. But I haven't heard about it so much at the level of issuing bonds. That was very much sort of a buy a brick kind of program, you know, to help the CLT, I think, buy their local pub as their first asset to stabilise their town, and then they snowballed from there into getting the local shop, and then, you know, a smokehouse for locally grown meats, and then starting to branch out into the farming and the housing and whatnot. So that was sort of used as the base of a sort of CLT-based economic strategy for a regional town. But yeah, not so much in the fractional lending and bond space that I'm aware of, unless there's stuff coming out of Europe, because there's a lot going on in Europe at the moment. But I've not heard it percolate up yet.
Yeah, it's in Canada, and they raised 110 million, or set to raise over 110 million. So that links in the chat there. So
yeah, it links. It also links to the it's not a bond, it's not a fractional, it's not a bond model, but it does link to the report that Corporation Housing just put out about using a co-op structure to structure a CLT, because they were looking at that as a possible mechanism for fundraising through people buying shares in the co-op that is the CLT. So it might be worth having a look at that, because I think we're starting to see things emerging a little bit in the space. So the more those cats can be herded, the better.
We've just started talking to a couple of investors in regards to the Regen Places network. So there's about 30 communities around the country that are sort of regeneratively focused. And so we're looking at putting together a platform for that, sort of help establish the community land trusts, or community-led assets at least. So keep driving, we'll see how that goes.
Cool.
Is there much happening with philanthropy and, you know, land being bequested or granted to CLTs to to establish things. From the Tasmanian experience, CLTs are mainly associated with conservation land trusts. So there's really massive reserves of private land that's been donated to land trusts for conservation, all of which was, philanthropically donated. And yeah, I suppose we're looking at a similar model in the CLT space for housing, but unsure how feasible that is. But encouraged by your presentation. Yeah.
I'm actually in Tasmania in a week's time to talk to a landowner that's looking to do community land trust out there, the northwest side. So
amazing.
Have a chat, and whatever connections come out of that, we can talk further. I know one of our partners, Peter Phibbs, is Hobart based, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, you guys should connect when you're in town. Yeah.
Yes, he's not at the University of Tasmania anymore, is he?
He was USyd. He's
USyd,
emeritus
okay.
now, so he's technically retired, but he's still as busy as he ever was. So
okay, I'll try to chase up a contact with you. Yeah, great. Oh, thank you.
Louise, can you tell me more about what the proposition was in terms of people's financial obligation as it was described to the CLT? And I'm interested from the perspective of how I think some of the co-ops and especially the community housing providers are looking at their co-op models in terms of gauging the rent, for want of a better word, against people's incomes, and that kind of goes up and down, as you earn more or less, and that seeming like a fair proposition, but also at the same time that it does kind of tie people into that model, because yes, the benefit, if your income goes down as you get older, then your rent goes down, but also that you're kind of sort of stuck in that system, and depending on where you need to be, that system may not exist or otherwise. And it seemed like part of the discussion suggested that people were kind of seeing that this was a fair and reasonable contribution, but that over time, while they might not accumulate wealth within housing, they might be able to redirect the savings into other possibilities. And what I'm thinking about is that it helps people direct their surplus into more productive elements of the economy, like entrepreneurialism and that kind of thing, rather than just wasting money in an unproductive product that is housing and kind of locking it up. But that sort of doesn't fit with that co-op model of, well, while you're earning more, we're just going to fleece you for market rate. And then when you're poor again, you're once again trapped in this welfare kind of model paradigm. Yeah, I'll just leave it there as half provocation, half question, I guess.
No, that's okay.
Blur, blur.
And I'll try and speak to the bits of it, but seeing out if I miss some. So to get to the first question, we didn't give them specific numbers because at the time there wasn't a site that we could base it on, but we said if it was a deduction of, depending on the site, between 25 and 50% to market. And given that these were people who were already doing the maths, like they were really acutely aware of what they thought they could sustain and the sorts of products that they were looking at. And so we were kind of relying on them doing that maths a bit in their head, which they were doing. They were sort of like, well, currently my price point's here, and that gets me this scale of place in this particular place. What would this difference make? And so they were able to think about it in terms of, oh, that means I could maybe come maybe it would be 30 kilometres closer into town, or if it was here in town, because we were saying, look, there are existing nonprofits, some of the CHPs, who are looking to develop this, so it could be in town, it could blah, blah, blah. So we kind of got them to do the thinking in terms of what they could sustain. And they knew already what they'd spoken to their banks about and what their repayments were going to be. And so they were sort of doing the internal calculations of like, yeah, this is going to be doable. This is going to, free things up in particular ways.
And so just to clarify, that 25 to 50%, is that based on figures now, or that as the market increases, they would maintain that 50% to market, but it would also increase?
Okay, so what we
Does that make sense?
Yep, what we said was, so that's the discount in terms of the price that you pay to buy. So if it's an apartment that's worth, say, 600,000, you're going to pay 400, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, that's then what your 400 is worth is calculated according to the resale formula. So we said that in the main, that's usually an agreed percentage of the uplift. And at the time, the most commonly used formula in the US was 25% of the agreed uplift in value. And so we said, look, it could be something like this because this is what is extant practice. So you buy it at a reduced rate, you do get an uplift, but it's not the full market uplift, because we've got to keep it affordable for the next person. That 25% seems to be, but again, we'd have to actually, and this is what we explained as well, is each CLT would have to actually do the modelling based on its local market and say what is going to probably best work in terms of giving people a bit of equity uplift, but not giving them so much that they've priced out the next person. So it would be a bit context specific. Again, we explained all of that and said, this is why we can't give you a hard and fast, because it will be context specific. And yet people were totally fine with it. And I think I totally hear you about the issue with rent-based models where, you potentially don't ever get to stop paying that rent. And I think that's where the limited equity co-ops have a little bit to offer when we look at the international models there, because what they do is they kind of have it a bit both ways. They charge you a little bit of an upfront premium, but it's not massive because they tend to go towards the very low and low income end of town. So they don't want to be bankrupting people in order to pay that premium, but they'll maybe make that, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, and then you're paying the rent, but you've got that nest egg that's sitting there with a formula working on it. So it's basically like a scaled down version fit to the income of the person. And that seems to work quite well, again, in terms of giving people enough of a buffer to be able to move on into something else if they need to, but while keeping it as an affordable product. I think the sort of zero equity co-ops, unless people are in a situation, and we've seen this, people do, if they're able to keep that stable housing, they are able to do other things that put them in a better position to then move out. But it's not always the case. But we know that with all forms of housing, that they can fail and not provide mobility. So I think, and that's why developing the language and being able to actually talk about the models is so important, so people can actually unpack the objectives and which is going to work best for what we're trying to do as an organisation or for what this place needs, rather than saying, oh, well, it's got to be XYZ and policy has to, lean into prioritising a singular form over others. But it's about getting those objectives clear and getting those definitional issues clear so that people can go, okay, yes, we know what that is, we know what this is, what's fit for us is this, maybe we'll mix it up a bit with that, to sort of, address those issues. What do we need in terms of mobility? What do we need in terms of stability? All of those variables that just don't get considered in other options. It's just, here it is. Do you want it or not?
No, that's right. And the other thing is that in the sort of zero equity co-ops or, other models like that, then there's this idea of like, oh, well, it cross-subsidizes so the richer people can help support the poorer people, except that the richer people are the people who are in the market, right? Like they're the real richer people. They're the actual rich people. And that and also that it's like, oh, well, we're going to have the rent payment for people on Centrelink and those sorts of things. And it's like, well, that's just money going directly to a private landlord. Let's not pretend that that's money going to a deserving or undeserving poor person. That's just money going to an investor who owns property.
Yeah, with the CRA, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the point that you raise about the sort of cross-subsidisation argument speaks a bit to the history of housing policy in the co-op space. So if we're focusing on the rental co-ops, because I know in New South Wales previously, they weren't subject to the community housing criteria, and so the New South Wales co-op sector was comprised in such a way that 65% of the residents had to be eligible for public housing, but the other 35% could be on any income. So then you were genuinely able to charge a market rent and have that in the mix. And some of the co-ops were able to generate quite healthy surpluses, which they've been able to redirect back into providing more rental housing and things like that. But with bringing the co-ops under community housing legislation, that has limited their income stream because they're now in a situation where people need to be eligible for that housing. It varies across the state as to whether they have to stay eligible, but it is definitely something that's impacted the sector.
I can see
Bill's got his hand up. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. If you were to promote a webinar or workshop to encourage people who'd never heard of community land trusts to attend such a workshop and popularize the concept, get people in the door where you could then explain the complexity, how would you do that? Would you talk about a community land trust, or would you use a different phrase, maybe something that's in the popular imagination already, something like the Nordic model, or something that is kind of sexy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and again, it actually came up at the same apartment workshop last week because there was a branding sort of expert in the room who came up to me and was like, "Do you guys need help?" Because I was like, "What do you mean?" Because it's not a sexy name, and it does sound like a conservation land trust. And the first thing that we say is this isn't a trust, because they're not actually trusts. And we tell people don't use a trust mechanism because they're really antithetical to the sorts of things that we need to do, like have residents be on the board and involved in governance. You actually can't do that under trust legislation because it's seen as a conflict of interest. So I think that's why with the forums, the focus groups, it was really good to just put it out there as, do you need affordable home ownership? Or are you trying to get into home ownership but unable to do so? Because that hooked people. And it actually came up in the data as well. When I was looking at it yesterday, there was a fellow who raised that exact point around, I think this just needs a different name. Like, I think, it just needs to be presented really simply as a product that's, here's the thing, what you can do. Because, with everything else sitting behind it, that's then explained as you go, rather than starting with that, because it can be a lot for people to think through. I mean, obviously in a context like the focus groups, we had the time to do it and just to actually talk through it with the people. And once they got it, they were like, oh yeah, absolutely. But in terms of having the general conversation, I think starting with hooks around, are you sick of renting, or do you want, you know, a home that you can call your own? You know, those sorts of simple hooks that speak to those really foundational and sort of ontological things around homemaking and stability and dignity and all of those things. So yeah, I think that one's a bit of a watch this space. I don't know, Kerry, and yeah.
Yeah, also just to say, I also think it is also really contextual, because in our situation where the gap between both rent and real estate prices and local wages is so huge, all we have to say is homes for locals. Yeah. That's our tagline. And everyone gets it straight away, because they just know that people who are on local wages haven't got a hope. And so those three words sort of get them to the table without having to say community land trust. I mean, that's in our name. But it's really interesting that, like, if you can come up with something that's really contextual in your location, I think that can help.
Yeah, there's one in the UK that's called Frolic. Which I'm not sure if that is an acronym, but I like,
awesome.
I really like that, and I quite like Carl's grounded. So yeah, perhaps the CLT goes into the appendix somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
The beauty of having that, so you obviously start with how you want. You call yours what you want, get people in the door. The beauty of still holding CLT is that we're part of a global movement that's been going for 4 decades, and so get anyone in the door how you can. You guys name it whatever you want. It doesn't. C is for community. You know what I mean? So keep it whatever. You know, keep it contextual, like Harry said, to the people. But having that lineage of work, so people go, oh well, I don't get it. It's very complex, even though it's like, well, look at 400 other models that have been done around the world and growing, you know, and so and then you get the whole global community feel. We had our AGM on World CLT Day. It's you know, it's great to have a lineage as well. It's important for them.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And that international sector is totally behind us as well, which is great. You know, they're, yeah, so, and I think it's a really, really good point, because that provides that sense of, oh, these things do work. You know, it's not just this conversation that we're having locally. There's this whole, like you say, yeah, it's actually, yeah, like, where are we now? 60 years of amazing things.
Yeah.
Grace has been following that the whole time.
Not quite, Michael.
So I can see the clock ticking. We're nearly at 3:30. And I noticed, Grace, you made an interesting comment on the chat, you know, asking people, what does home mean to you, which is always a really great way to dive into the conversation and get people thinking, and to get language. So I'm wondering if there's any more conversation before we wind up. I just want to mention the next community of practice, but any last calls for comments or questions for Louise?
Just thank you. Thank you so much, Louise. Wonderful research.
Really pleased to get it out there. So yeah, take it and run.
It's really helpful. It's fantastic. And really
thanks so much. Yeah.
So can I give us a plug before everyone goes that our next community of practice is on November the 13th at the same time, and we're particularly focusing on the activating community development and community building dimension of community land trusts. So how do you do that? How do we get a group going in a community? What have we learned? What's worked? What hasn't? Sharing our tips with each other. So there was a bit of interest in that as a topic. So I hope that we can all come back to help each other with that challenging arena. And Rose, have you just put the
Yeah,
link?
I did. I just put the link in disregard. It says September. That was just me being very tired at the end of the day. It's actually November.
Yes, so
yeah.
Okay, so if anyone wants to register for that before we finish, the link's just on the chat. Well, I've really enjoyed this session. It was so great to meet everybody and hear people's questions and thoughts, and really great to do the deep dive into the research, Louise. Thank you. And thank you, Rose, for organising us and supporting us. And we'll look forward to coming together again.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for steering us, Kerry.
Pleasure.
Yes, Karen, thank you.
Great to see everyone.
Okay.
Talk again soon.
Nice to meet you all.
See
Bye.
you, everybody.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.